Ben Martinez had worked countless night shifts as a security guard, from quiet office buildings to rowdy concert venues. But when he was assigned to the old Hawthorne Psychiatric Hospital, even his seasoned nerves felt a twinge of unease. The building had been abandoned for over 30 years, its decaying facade and shattered windows a testament to the tragedies that had transpired within its walls. Rumors swirled around the place, whispers of inhumane treatments, ghostly sightings, and the unexplained disappearances of those who dared trespass. Ben, a pragmatic man, brushed off the tales as exaggerations. It was just a job, he reminded himself as he adjusted his cap and flashlight, the tools that would be his only companions on this long, lonely night. The moment he stepped inside, the air changed. The musty scent of mildew was overpowering, mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp that made him shudder. The hallway stretched before him, dim and cracked, the flickering beam of his flashlight playing tricks on the peeling walls. Hours passed without incident, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. He paced the corridors, stopping every so often to check the doors of the patient rooms, each labeled with a rusted plaque bearing a number. Most were empty, but one room stopped him cold. Room 209. The door, unlike the others, was slightly ajar. From within, a faint whisper echoed, sending a shiver up his spine. Ben swallowed hard and stepped inside, half expecting to find a vagrant or wild animal. But the room was empty, save for an old rocking chair that faced the window, gently moving as though propelled by an unseen hand. Suddenly, the static of his radio crackled to life, making him jump. "Ben, do you copy?" The dispatcher's voice was garbled, filled with interference. "Yeah, I'm here," he stammered, eyes still locked on the chair. Ben's heartbeat thundered as he took a tentative step closer to the rocking chair. The air in room 209 seemed heavier, suffocating, as though a presence was pushing against him. He reached out, the flashlight beam quivering in his hand to stop the chair's motion. Just as his fingers brushed the cracked wood, it stopped. The sudden stillness was deafening. A shadow skittered across the corner of his vision, vanishing into the hallway with impossible speed. Whipping around, Ben pointed his flashlight into the corridor, its beam stretching to the far end where darkness devoured the light. He felt sweat trickle down his back, chilling his skin despite the warm summer night. "Is anyone there?" he called, his voice echoing down the long corridor. Silence. He strained to hear any response, the pounding of his heart the only sound. Then, almost imperceptibly, came a faint giggle, a child's laugh. Ben's breath caught. There were no children here. There hadn't been for decades. He backed out of room 209, closing the door firmly behind him and whispering a curse under his breath. His radio buzzed again, this time only emitting a soft, distorted hum. He turned it off, the silence preferable to the nerve-wracking static. As he continued his patrol, he became aware of the temperature dropping. His breath fogged in the air as he passed room 303, the room where, according to legend, a nurse had taken her life after an outbreak of violence left 3 patients dead. The door rattled violently as he walked by, as if someone or something inside was trying to escape. Ben's rational mind screamed at him to leave, but the guard in him, bound by duty and pride, pushed him forward. He squared his shoulders and tightened his grip on the flashlight as he pushed the door open. The door creaked open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. The room was pitch dark, with only Ben's flashlight slicing through the gloom. He swept the beam across the room, the light catching cracked tiles and broken furniture. An overturned bed lay in the center, its sheets yellowed with age. But nothing moved. The silence was so profound he could almost hear the blood rushing in his ears. Suddenly, the temperature dropped further, and he could see his breath condense in front of him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. It was then that he noticed the mirror. It stood on the far side of the room, half cracked and dusty. Yet, within its shattered surface, a faint movement caught his eye, a shape that wasn't there in the room itself. He stepped closer, heart pounding with a mixture of dread and compulsion. The image in the mirror grew clearer. A figure, dressed in a nurse's uniform, stood staring back at him with hollow eyes, lips frozen in a silent scream. Her face was pallid, streaked with black tears that seemed to drip and vanish. Ben stumbled backward, a gasp escaping his lips. The door behind him slammed shut, the echo thundering like a gunshot. The flashlight flickered as an icy wind whipped through the room, swirling papers and dust into the air. The nurse's reflection moved, tilting her head as if curious. Then, without warning, she reached out, her hand pressing against the glass from within. A voice, low and guttural, whispered in Ben's ear, "You shouldn't have come." Panic surged through him. Ben's hands shook as he gripped the doorknob, yanking and twisting, but it wouldn't budge. The whisper turned into a chorus of dissonant voices, rising and falling in waves that made his head throb. Shadows flitted along the edges of the room, darting just beyond the flashlight's reach. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the urge to collapse. He had to focus, had to get out. With one last desperate twist, the door flung open and he tumbled into the hallway. The noise stopped as abruptly as it had started. The sudden silence was like a slap. He scrambled to his feet, breathless and disoriented. The hallway stretched out before him, impossibly long and shrouded in gloom. At the far end, the emergency exit sign flickered, casting an anemic red glow that barely penetrated the darkness. He started to run, each step echoing like a gunshot. Behind him, a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap followed, as though someone, or something, was walking in pursuit. He dared not look back. Ben burst through the emergency exit, the cool night air slamming into him like a wave. He bent over, gasping for breath, his lungs burning. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights. He glanced over his shoulder. The tapping had stopped. Inside, shadows moved behind the windows of room 303. The nurse, now visible only as a silhouette, watched him with lifeless eyes before fading into the darkness. Ben didn't wait another second. He jumped into his car, fumbled the keys into the ignition, and peeled out of the lot without a backward glance. The asylum loomed in his rearview mirror, a monument to terror, as its dark windows seemed to stare back knowingly. He vowed never to return to the night shift at St. Mary's Sanitarium. But as he sped down the lonely road, the sound of a whisper echoed in his mind, a parting gift from whatever still lingered within those haunted walls. This isn't over.
Lisa had always prided herself on being fearless. Growing up in a family of police officers, she was used to confronting danger. But nothing in her life had prepared her for the eerie quiet that settled over the warehouse on her first night shift. The building was massive, a relic of the 1970s with high ceilings and endless rows of shelves stacked with products waiting to be shipped. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting harsh, sterile light that failed to reach the shadowy corners. Lisa clocked in, nodding to Jerry, the aging security guard whose shift overlapped with hers for the first hour. "Stay sharp tonight," Jerry muttered, his eyes darting toward the darkened aisles. "Weird stuff happens around here after midnight." Lisa chuckled. "Ghost stories? Really, Jerry?" "Suit yourself," he said, tapping his flashlight and walking out the side exit. The heavy metal door clanged shut behind him, leaving Lisa in silence. She settled into her routine, checking the inventory logs and making rounds. The minutes ticked by uneventfully until the distant sound of something metallic hitting the concrete floor sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Lisa's pulse quickened as the sound echoed through the aisles. She grabbed her flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom, and stepped cautiously toward the noise. The warehouse felt colder now, the chill sinking into her bones. Rows of tightly packed shelves loomed over her, casting jagged, uneven shadows that shifted as she moved. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. It was absurd, she told herself. The wind, maybe a stray cat, something explainable. Silence. She exhaled, half relieved, and turned to go back to her desk when a loud scraping sound made her freeze. It was as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor 2 aisles down. Her throat tightened, and she forced herself to walk toward it, each step deliberate and echoing in the silence. When she rounded the corner, the light fell upon a pallet jack that had been moved several feet from where it had stood just minutes before. Lisa's breath caught in her chest. The wheel still spun as if it had just been pushed. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice echoing uselessly in the cavernous space. No response. A shiver ran down her spine as she took a step closer to inspect it. Suddenly, a loud, sharp knock echoed from the other side of the aisle. She whipped around, heart thundering in her chest. The shadow seemed to deepen, closing in like a suffocating blanket. The warehouse groaned as the metal beams shifted, or so it seemed. Lisa tried to steady her breathing, the flashlight trembling in her grasp. As she backed away, she noticed something glinting on the floor, a small rusted key. It hadn't been there before. Bending down, she picked it up and examined it. It was old, its teeth worn smooth, but there was no indication of what it might unlock. A sudden movement caught her attention in her peripheral vision, a dark shape darting behind the shelves. "Hey, stop right there," she shouted, adrenaline overtaking her fear. She sprinted toward the spot, the sound of her own footsteps thudding loudly in her ears. But as she turned the corner, the air felt different, colder. A distinct smell of earth and decay filled her nostrils. The beam of her flashlight revealed nothing but stacked boxes and crates. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the distant hum of the lights. Just as she was about to turn back, a soft, whispering voice came from behind her. "Leave while you can." Lisa spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. There was no one there. Her pulse raced as the sound of faint footsteps scurried away, disappearing into the darkness. Back at her desk, Lisa could barely keep her hand steady as she dialed Jerry's number. It rang and rang until his voicemail clicked on. She cursed under her breath and set the phone down, the weight of the key in her pocket pressing against her leg like an accusation. As she tried to gather her thoughts, the warehouse's overhead lights flickered. For a moment, everything was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, a door stood ajar at the far end of the warehouse, one she hadn't noticed before, the far end of the warehouse that Lisa had never noticed before. The door was old, weathered, its paint peeling to reveal splintered wood underneath. It wasn't supposed to be there. She felt the cold metal of the key in her pocket as though it burned. Her instinct screamed at her to leave, to run out the front door and never come back. But something deeper, a nagging curiosity mixed with an irrational compulsion, propelled her forward. The silence was so complete that each creak of the floor beneath her sneakers sounded deafening. The closer she got to the mysterious door, the heavier the air felt pressing against her chest and shoulders as if trying to hold her back. With a shaky hand, she reached out and pushed the door open. It groaned like a living thing, and the darkness beyond seemed to breathe in her presence. The beam of her flashlight revealed a narrow descending staircase, carved from stone and slick with damp moss. A chill wind swept up from the depths, carrying with it a whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. "Come closer." She stepped back, fear finally overwhelming her curiosity. But just as she turned to retreat, the door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into darkness. The flashlight's beam flickered and died, leaving her in pitch black. Lisa's heartbeat pounded in her ears, drowning out rational thought. She fumbled for her phone, using its dim glow to illuminate the immediate area. The key felt heavier in her pocket, almost buzzing. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You shouldn't have come." Without another choice, she turned and descended the steps. The air grew colder, and the stone walls narrowed until they almost scraped her shoulders. Her breaths came in short gasps, clouds forming in the frosty air. When she reached the bottom, the light from her phone caught something carved into the wall. Strange symbols, each one more twisted and grotesque than the last. A sudden roar, not human nor animal, shook the ground beneath her feet. The key in her pocket grew searing hot, forcing her to drop it. The moment it hit the ground, the whisper rose into a chorus of tormented voices, echoing in the small space. "Leave! Leave! Leave!" they chanted, their voices like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows stretched toward her, fingers of darkness clawing at her clothes and hair. Lisa screamed, stumbling backward. The key glowed a sickly red on the floor, and the door at the top of the stairs burst open, flooding the stairwell with light. She scrambled up, ignoring the cold hands of shadow that tried to pull her back. As she emerged into the warehouse, the door slammed shut behind her, disappearing as though it had never been there. The key lay in her hand, cool and lifeless. The warehouse was silent once more, but the whispers echoed in her mind, a reminder of what she had seen and what still lingered below. When Jerry arrived the next morning, he found Lisa sitting at her desk, eyes wide and unblinking. She held the key tightly, her knuckles white. "There's something in this warehouse," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "and it wants out." Sarah had worked the night shift as a nurse at St. Christopher's Hospital for years. It was an old building, with corridors that twisted and turned like a maze. On most nights, the soft hum of monitors, the occasional groan of a patient, and the fluorescent lights buzzing above were the only sounds that accompanied her rounds. But that night was different. The air seemed heavier, shadows lingered longer than they should, and an unsettling silence hung over the empty halls. Her first round was uneventful, save for the feeling that she was being watched. She brushed it off as exhaustion, reminding herself that she had doubled her shifts all week. By her second round at 2 a.m., the hospital felt colder, as if a draft had found its way inside. She pulled her cardigan tighter and moved to check Ward 7B, a wing that had been shut down years ago for renovations that never happened. As she walked past, she heard it, a faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, coming from somewhere deep within the ward. Sarah stopped in her tracks, listening. The tapping turned into a soft, irregular scratching, like nails dragged across an old wooden table. "Hello?" Her voice echoed, swallowed by the emptiness. The scratching stopped. For a moment there was only silence, and then a low, guttural laugh erupted from the darkness. The sound was so out of place, so raw, that every hair on her body stood on end. She froze, unable to move or breathe, as the laughter stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The hospital intercom crackled to life, and a voice whispered her name. "Sarah." Panic surged through her veins as she bolted down the hallway. The lights flickered overhead, casting her shadow in a distorted dance as she ran. She rounded the corner and crashed into James, the security guard. "Whoa, Sarah, what's wrong?" His voice was steady, his eyes wide with concern. There's someone in Ward 7B. I heard them laughing and they said my name on the intercom." She gasped for air, her pulse thundering in her ears. James frowned. "That wing's been shut down for years. There's no intercom system connected there anymore." Before she could respond, the intercom crackled again, but this time it played a lullaby, hauntingly slow and broken, echoing through the hall. James's face paled, and without another word, they rushed back toward Ward 7B. The door was ajar, something it hadn't been in years. They pushed it open, and cold air rushed past them. The room beyond was dark, filled with old hospital beds covered in dusty white sheets. In the center of the room stood an old wheelchair facing them. It slowly started to turn on its own, the creak piercing the silence. Suddenly, a figure appeared behind it, pale and translucent, eyes wide and empty. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out, only the faint whisper of the name. "Sarah." James stepped back, shaking. "We need to go. Now." Sarah's eyes were locked on the figure, unable to look away, but as they backed out of the room, the door slammed shut and the whispering ceased. The two never spoke of that night again, but Sarah never returned for another shift, and the story of Ward 7B remained an unsolved, chilling mystery in the halls of St. Christopher's Hospital. James grabbed Sarah's arm, snapping her out of her trance. They stumbled backward, their footsteps echoing as they bolted from the room. The door to Ward 7B slammed shut behind them, the impact reverberating through the hall. The eerie lullaby from the intercom faded into silence, leaving only the sound of their ragged breaths. They paused near the nurses' station, both too stunned to speak. The hospital felt even colder now, and a thick, suffocating tension filled the air. James picked up the phone to call the main security office, but the line was dead. Nothing but static. Sarah's heart pounded as she tried to process what she'd just seen. The translucent figure, the wheelchair moving on its own, the voice calling her name. It felt like a scene from a nightmare. But this was real, and there was no waking up. "We need to get everyone out of here," James whispered, his voice shaking. Sarah nodded, turning to face the hallway. Her shift was supposed to be routine, just another night at St. Christopher's. But now she wasn't sure if they'd make it to morning. James motioned for Sarah to follow him as they cautiously moved down the hallway, checking each room they passed. Most were empty, lifeless save for the sterile scent of disinfectant and faint echoes of their own movements. The lights flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced on the walls, playing tricks on their eyes. Suddenly, a deep, low hum began to resonate through the corridor. It felt like a vibration in their chests, growing louder with every second. Sarah stopped, eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, clutching her flashlight tightly. James nodded, eyes scanning for the source. The hum morphed into a deep, guttural moan that came from the end of the hallway. A door creaked open, ever so slowly, and out of the darkness stepped a figure. It was clad in a hospital gown, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through them. The figure's mouth opened, and an anguished cry erupted, echoing off the walls. The force of it sent a chill down their spines. James instinctively grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back. "Run," he said, his voice barely a breath. They turned and sprinted, their shoes slapping against the linoleum as they fled toward the emergency exit. The wailing behind them grew fainter, but a cold presence seemed to chase them, nipping at their heels.